Okay, so welcome back to the second part of the video. So now what we're going to do is go a little bit more in depth into the HTML file and the JavaScript file and kind of show you how the two of them are connected together and discuss a little bit about MVC as a concept and how we're implementing MVC with this application. So first of all, we've got the HTML file here and we have collapsed the style because this is largely irrelevant for what we're trying to do right now. So at the very top of this thing, we've got one big div. And if you are not familiar with HTML, effectively a div is just an empty sort of UI element. It doesn't really do anything by itself. It's basically just a container. And this UI element or this empty div, well, I guess it's not empty. This div itself has two primary things that kind of separate it from all the other divs in the file. And you can see that there are quite a number of these things. So first, we have NGApp, which actually gives us the application name of the Angular app that we're creating. And we have NGController, which actually binds this view to a controller that is implemented in JavaScript. So if you think about MVVM, what we had is we had view models and we had a view, and the view was XAML and the view model was C# behind the XAML, and then the sort of models would be things that we would pass off to persistence that we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks. In this case, what we have is we have this HTML that largely kind of looks like XAML in a lot of ways. It's much more dynamic, in my opinion. It has a lot of additional accoutrement that XAML doesn't necessarily have. And the primary reason why, in my opinion, HTML is better than XAML is that binding is very, very easy. But before we get to binding, we have to talk about the controller. So this thing is the view. The controller lives in app.js. So in app.js, we are doing two things. We are first creating an Angular module that has the name of the application, and we are enabling this thing for NGRoute. We are not using NGRoute, but I wanted to give you this as kind of a shell. So if you wanted to go off and look at NG routing with the links that I provide in Canvas, it's kind of already set up for you to kind of make your life a little bit easier. So in the controller itself, you will find that this name, so the name passed into the controller as constructor, matches this name exactly. And so this naming convention here is what is tying this specific JavaScript controller entity to this div. So everything that's inside of this div will have this controller's scope. So JavaScript scope is a thing that is well beyond the scope of this class. So I'm not going to go into very much detail in it, but again, I'm gonna put a link to the W3 Schools sort of tutorial in all things JavaScript and Angular, and it will make a heck of a lot of sense if you deem it necessary to sort of do your projects in Angular. Scope, you can kind of think of it as the scope of a variable in C#, for example. So this scope right here is good for this controller. If you leave this controller, this scope will go away. So there will no longer be a scope next semester. You will have to recreate this thing. If you want to pass data across controllers, you could potentially have multiple controllers and multiple views. So you could have another div immediately below this one with a completely different controller. It would have a different scope. You can use a root scope, and you can pass the root scope around the controllers. That, again, is outside the scope of this class. We don't actually need it in order to build the SPA that we're looking at here. It's just kind of additional information. So what we have is we have a view and we have a controller. The controller deals with all the data, and it also deals with all of the behavior. The view presents you all of the information from the controller and also gives you a direct link to the controller so that you can actually interact with all of the behavior. So what we're going to do is we're kind of going to try to go through block by block and sort of explain each of these pieces by mapping them to the actual physical application. And so if you kind of pull these things up, if you have two monitors, you can kind of pull this application up and the code up at the same time. That's great. I haven't figured out how to record both monitors at the same time, so I'm going to have to kind of swap back and forth. So maybe make it a little bit easier. Like that. And then like this. Okay. So at the top, we have welcome to computer science at FSU's accreditation system. So this thing is ultimately, when we it kind of grows up over the next couple of weeks, what we're going to be able to do is add courses, add instructors, add all of that kind of information, and then store documents like syllabi and things like that. That's the purpose of this kind of thing. And so then we see that we have this div, and it kind of separates the application from the header. And then we go into this thing called NGRepeat. So NGRepeat, anytime you see NG hyphen anything, this thing for whatever reason stands for Angular. That is beyond me, but okay. So NGRepeat and NGClick and NGModel, which we'll see a little bit further down, all of these things are called directives. And so what you do is you can actually pass JavaScript expressions to these things. And so what is happening here is I am repeating over a list called semesters in my controller. And I am taking this as the enumeration variable, and I am building these pieces for every element in my semesters list. And so if we go back over here, we look at scope.semesters, then you will see that I have fall 2019, spring 2020, and summer 2020, and lo and behold, that's exactly what you see over here: fall, spring, summer. So this is an example of how you can do kind of repeated UI elements in HTML5 and JavaScript, which is a very nice thing that you are going to have a harder time doing in something like Xamarin. This is a much nicer experience. And also, you can see that we can nest these things infinitely. So I have for each semester, I have a nice div that's just a container that gives you the name of the semester, but I also have the ability to add a button, which is this button right here, that will allow me to actually call behavior. So let's talk a little bit about data binding. So you remember in WPF, this data binding stuff was this kind of hilarious syntax that had data context, and it had binding two-way versus one-way flags, and it had iNotifyPropertyChanged events, and it had all these kind of strings and requirements attached to it. That's not the case here. So anytime you see two curly braces, that means that some JavaScript is going to be evaluated. So this is just a JavaScript expression. And what is happening is, because we are repeating over the list of semesters, we can take this iteration variable and we can actually access any data that's on that iteration variable. And so here we're taking the name of each of the semesters, and we are simply binding the contents of the div to be the name of the semester. And so if you go back to app.js, the name is set here, the name is set here. Perfect. But binding is not just for data, it's also for behavior. And so here we have this button, and that button corresponds to these dudes right here. And ngClick, again, is a directive, and what this is doing is it is binding a JavaScript function to this ngClick event. And so while these things are slightly different, they are much easier than the XAML alternative. Here you're basically just giving the name of a function and you're passing a parameter in. And so if you go to app.js, we're going to look for remove semester, and lo and behold, it's here. It accepts an ID, and basically what's going to happen is we're going to iterate over the list of semesters. We're going to figure out when you find the semester with the specified ID. We're going to set the index to delete to be that index, and then we're going to come and splice out that index. And so splice is JavaScript for remove this thing, and has an optional parameter. You can remove one or more things after that index. And so if you go back here, I'm going to close that. Go back here. What we're doing is we are again using data on the semester, the iteration variable inside of my loop. And I am passing the ID of that semester to remove semester, which comes in and does a fairly rudimentary calculation. And so if I click this X, my fall goes away and everyone is happy. So if I refresh, everything comes back because every time I refresh the browser, it goes back to HTML. At the top, I have script app.js, which means this thing gets evaluated. And in here, I have, I'm setting up these variables. So the semesters thing gets reloaded every time I reload the site. And this is the very first thing we'll fix next week, because we'll actually be reading this out of a database instead. Or not out of a database, we'll read it from the server side first, and then the next week do the database. So this little bit of code right here tells you a lot about the sort of same concepts that we went over in the WPF stuff, except this is the new age way of doing it. You don't have to do it with XAML, you can do it in HTML5. And if you're doing new development on Windows mobile platform, so UWP, UWP actually allows you to use HTML5 and C# instead of XAML and C#, which is a much nicer experience in my opinion. So now, if we look down a little bit, so this is iterating over all semesters and it's building this list. The next thing is this div right here that has a button. And so what is happening here is this button has is accessing Font Awesome. So really quick kind of explanation of what this is. So Font Awesome, you can get it from NuGet. So if you go to Tools and you go to NuGet Package Manager, if you're not running the application, there'll be a third option here that says Manage NuGet Packages for Solution. You can go in there, you can look for Font Awesome, you can download the free version to your application, and then you get access to all of these class tags, and each of those class tags actually corresponds to a symbol. And so you can actually look up Font Awesome. Their website will allow you to search and will tell you exactly what to put here in the quotes. So FAS is usually the solid font instead of dashed or shadow or whatever. And these things, you can actually use IntelliSense in Visual Studio to find these, which is what I did. So this I tag, what it does is it lets you put that font easily inside of a button. And so here what I've done is I've nested that I to get my plus sign inside of a button, and I have made the conscious, a little bit hilarious choice to not put the ngClick event on the button, but to put the ngClick event on the div, to show you that it doesn't actually matter all that much in HTML5 versus WPF. So if you remember WPF, not everything in WPF has a click event, but most things in HTML5 do. And so it doesn't actually matter if you have the ngClick event on the button or on the div. What's happening is exactly the same thing that was happening before, except here, show new semester is a different function. And so if we go back to app.js, we look for show new semester, we find that all that's happening here is we are setting the selected semester to be undefined, and we are setting the adding semester flag to true. And so that doesn't make a whole bunch of sense from our perspective right now. If we click this thing, magic happens. And so we kind of are left to figure out why this is the way it is and how it's working. So if we go back here and we look for adding semester. So adding semester, load and hold is down here. And it is in this NGShow. So NGShow is the penultimate directive that we want to talk about in this video, or really in this week. And NGShow, what it does is it collapses HTML5 elements or aspects of the DOM when this evaluates to false. So if we go back over here, here we notice that we are setting this thing to true, but every time we want to select a semester, we are setting this thing to false. So if I were to go to fall, I've set it to false, and now that thing has gone away. And we have set a selected semester, and so the semester being set means that the semester is not undefined, and I'm not adding the semester, which means this block is being shown in the DOM instead of this block. So this is what I was talking about in the last video about our approach to SPA in this video and in this course, it being a little bit of a workaround or a little bit of a hack. Well, less a hack and more of a clever ruse. We are actually just using one view, and we are building that view on the fly based on Boolean flags, effectively. But you could just as easily compose a view of multiple different views and then have NGRoute to sort of switch you back and forth using routes in the URL. And so routes in the URL are going to be extremely important for calling our server-side URLs. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit at length next week. So if we look at what is happening when adding semester is set to true, I have a label and I have an input value. And this is the last directive we want to talk about, and it is called NGModel. So what NGModel does is it binds this input. You can also bind text areas, you can bind list boxes and combo boxes and all that kind of stuff directly to a parameter or a property on the controller. So if you look in the controller, I have selected semesters, I have selected classes, and what this is doing is it is taking the selected semester and it is specifying the name. So if I type a new name in here, fall 2020, that is going to be on a new selected semester. And now I have these two buttons, cancel and OK. And so I have cancel and I have OK. Both of these have an ngClick event. And so if I go back to my controller, you can see cancel add semester is here, add semester is here. What is happening is I am setting the name on this selected semester in the UI, so it's directly bound. If I want to add a new semester, though, I need to give this thing an ID. So ID mapping is going to be extremely important next week going forward. These IDs typically come from the database, but I am mocking it here because I don't have a database. I haven't explained how to get to the database yet. So what is happening here is we are setting this counter. So next semester is going to be my next key. So this is going to be 3, and then every semester that I add, I'm going to bump that key up. So this is a semester 0, 1, 2, then 3, 4, 5, 6, blah, 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 blah. The database will take care of this stuff as of 2 weeks from now. After that, I'm going to push my newly created semester into my list of semesters. I'm going to unset my selected semester. I'm going to unset my adding semester flag. So if I hit OK here, I get this added to my list. So by virtue of being in the list, it's bound to this div, and so it's going to continue to grow on and on and on. And then because I unset my selected semester and I unset the adding semester flag, it hid this UI component. And so that's typically best practice because you want the user to know that they actually did something. They're not just sort of sitting around waiting for it to happen. So if I try to do the same thing, and this is going to be test or something, if I hit cancel, what's going to happen is we're going to skip all this good stuff. And what we're going to do is unset the selected semester. We're going to unset the adding semester flag, and everything will go, oh, I hit OK. Cancel, it will all go back to unset. And so it undoes my attempt at creating a semester that I didn't actually want. And so this pattern of having a selected entity and then managing that entity with a list of entities that then bubbles up to a list of the sort of generated UI is all over the place in SPAs. And so a large reason why we wait until next week to introduce link proper in the course is because there are so many lists that come across from the server that it makes sense to start using something like link on the server side to present the controller better code or better data than otherwise. So we've got selected semester. We're going to see the exact same thing if we go back to this. So we talked about this block. This is trying to add a new semester. If I'm not interested in adding a new semester, that means I'm interested in looking at a semester that already exists. So in here, what we're going to do is we're going to use the same ng repeat, but this one's going to be slightly more complicated. And so here I have class in classes, but I'm using this handy dandy filter thing. So what this is doing is instead of taking all of the entities, so rather than going across all of the different classes, I'm only going to take and generate UI for the classes that fit this criteria. So I'm only going to list the courses that are in this specified semester. And so this is where ID linking starts to really matter a lot. And we're going to talk at length about ID matching with ORM in the persistence module. So for the time being, this selected semester ID stuff is being handled by the mock. And so as we add a new semester, this ID it gets incremented. And then as we add a class, which we'll go over in just a second, we're going to start implementing a link between the ID on the new class and the ID of the semester so that when we click around semesters, we'll actually get the correct list of classes. So here we've got an NGShow, and this NGShow is so that if I don't have any semester chosen, I don't see this button, I don't see anything. So if I do that, I don't see anything, so it hides even this part. So that's why there's an NGShow nested inside of the other one. So in here, there's an ng click on each of the classes, and so when you select the class, what will end up happening is you will go into the select class method. So over here, if I go to the select class, selected class. I unset adding class, which means I'm going to hide the alternative UI. And then I'm going to set my selected class to be the thing that I passed in. And so here I'm passing in the class, which again is the iteration variable for my loop. And then as long as my selected class is not undefined, that's when I actually start seeing the instructor and the enrollment count. And so this sets a flag. That flag triggers this NGShow, which then shows you these things. In addition to clicking just classes, what we can do is we can add a new class. So exactly like we did with the semesters, we can click this button right. This thing has show new class. So when I click this, it is going to trigger show new class. Show new class. Adding class is going to be true, which means that there is a div add new class, adding class here. And so this is a essentially a form layout, and we're going to look at that in just a second. But this flag unhides this so that you can actually see it. Then what we're going to do is we're going to use a lot of people would say a bastardization of JavaScript to create a new basically JSON blob that is the selected class. Each of these input boxes is going to be tied to a property on that object, but some of this stuff actually exists on the course and not the class. So for example, the class code and the class name, these things are on a course. These things are on a class. So basically courses can have multiple implementations. So you can have 58 different theory of computation classes. Each of those could have a different instructor and a different enrollment, but all of them are going to have the same class code. All of them are going to have the same name. And they could exist in multiple different semesters. And so this is kind of the ins and outs of data management. There are only so many different ways these things can go, and that's kind of why I use this as an example. So here we have to do this twice. The reason is because this thing and this thing is going to be bound to the course on the selected class. This thing and this thing is going to be bound to just the selected class. So we come back over here and we look at this thing. We're using display table row, and the reason we're using that is to make sure that this all is a row and it isn't side by side by side by side by side. And this is sort of a very popular kind of UI pattern for creating labels and associated input boxes. And so here what we're doing is we're simply to-a binding using NGModel. And so like I said, we have selected class .course code for the first one, course name for the second one, then instructor and enrollment for the bottom two. At the end, we have another table row. That table row has a cancel and an OK button. Cancel and an OK button. And if you look at cancel add class, cancel. Aha. So this is what I was talking about. So in the previous video, which was like, I don't know, 35 minutes ago, I saw that this thing doesn't work. The reason is because add class isn't implemented at all. And that's an unfortunate artifact of me implementing it in the wrong version of the project. So this is the add class and the cancel add class that you are looking for. And I will update Canvas appropriately. But if we add those things, save, and come over here and reload the page. And do class code. hit OK. And now we have created this brand new thing. And the reason is because we have taken the semester ID of the selected semester, we've slammed that onto the selected class so that it appears in the correct list. And then we have simply pushed that selected class that was bound to all of our form controls into our list, then unset the selected class and unset the adding class to get rid of that UI. And so we could do people or some ridiculous thing. We can continue to add these things over and over and over and over and over again. So take a look at this, take a look at this, and kind of convince yourself that these are exactly the same code patterns. And what we're actually going to find through the last couple modules in the class is that this stuff happens over and over and over and over again. And so the fine people who are building Canvas, the fine people who built your banking app that is on your phone, the fine people who built name your favorite data management or manipulation app, they have rewritten and rewritten and rewritten the wheel hundreds of thousands of times over, and so code generation becomes very, very possible for things like this. We can actually do this fairly easily. So the last thing that we have not looked at is removal. If we look at the removal of semesters, we'll go bottom up. So if we look at spring 2020, I only have one course listed in here. And so I have a remove course, remove class in here. So what we are doing is we are going in here, we're passing an ID. And so this is the same as we saw with the semesters a little bit ago. And we're going to use the same pattern here again. So we're going to look through our list of classes until we find the index of the class that has the correct ID to delete. We're going to splice that thing out of the list, and then if we are we've selected that class, we're also going to blow up this view so that you're not kind of like looking at a ghost class data from a class that doesn't exist anymore. So if I hit the X there, the whole thing goes away. And that is, again, the same as remove semester, which if you look at this piece of code and this piece of code, the only thing that is different is the list name, semesters and classes. So this is a prime candidate for T4 templating. We can actually just replace the name with the name of the entity, and suddenly we don't ever have to write a remove function again. We can just generate it as long as we have unique names. So if I hit X here, I can do away with that, and everything is cool. So the third video I'm going to end up posting tomorrow, and the third video, the whole point of it is going to be looking at how can we go from these functions, so these things are behavior that we're going to use to interact with the server-side code. So we can use the $HTTP library, or whatever you want to call it in JavaScript, to make the HTTP request of our service. But we haven't built a service yet, so what we're going to do is we're going to do one more example of an SPA where we can click a button and call a Google service that's already spun up for us, so that we can just see the HTTP syntax, which is a little bit cumbersome, and I want to do it now instead of lumping it in with all the stuff we have to do next week. So this week is a little bit of a gimme because this is all kind of new content. I want to update the class to include things like SPAs, but I don't necessarily want to unnecessarily burden you with learning JavaScript and HTML5 and Angular or React at the same time as you're learning C#. Again, you can use this information if you'd like but I kind of hesitant to make it a hard requirement in the course. But the third video in this lecture, or in this module, what it's going to do is show you how we're going to start making calls to the server-side code, whether you want to use an SPA, or if you want to use a console app, or you want to use a WPF app. It's all kind of the same song and dance. So thanks for tuning in, and I will post the next video in the next maybe day. Take a look at that, and then we'll get you ready for the stuff that we're going to do next week. There will be a significantly higher amount of content in next week's module than this week or last week, and because these 2 weeks have really been building up toward that content. So thanks again, and please, as always, let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, and I appreciate you very much. Thanks.